Good afternoon. I'm here with my guest, George Ellenbogen. Is that how it's pronounced, or Bogen?
Bogen.
Okay. And he's a Luntsman, which is always good. He has a new bio out. It's fairly new, isn't it?
Came out a couple of years ago.
Okay. And it's called In Search of Neighborhood. And he's also a prolific and well-respected poet. He has a book out called Morning Gothic. So we're going to discuss that, and he'll have a chance to read from his work and on this rainy night here on Election Day. Okay. Now, you know, going to your memoir, the title is Search of Neighborhood. You had a very close knit neighborhood in the 40s and 50s in Montreal. I mean, and you know, basically, you know, you mentioned something about death from the suburbs, the encroaching suburbs, and you know, I grew up in the suburbs. My parents came from the Bronx, and it was more of a neighborhood. You know, what are the pros and cons, do you think, of living in a close knit neighborhood and the cons of it? And this is a close-knit Jewish neighborhood, yeah.
Yeah. First, let me say that it was really a homogeneous neighborhood, in the sense that you found neighborhoods like this in cities for the first half of the 20th century all over North America.
Sort of like a Jane Jacob type of neighborhoods, right? You know, where this...
Which I'm not familiar.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
But the street I lived in had one family that was not Jewish. Mm-hmm. The high school that I went to had 1,100 students. Probably no more than half a dozen were not Jewish. It was
provincial.
What I would describe as a ghetto, basically, like Vilna or Łódź in Poland. And I suppose one might say that, gee, growing up in an area like that, there's a certain kind of cultural deprivation. You're separated from the rest of the world. In Montreal, in a sense, it was like being a little tugboat between a British man of war and a French man of war. But it was very comforting in a sense.
I could say.
I had my grandmother lived a couple of blocks away in one direction, an aunt in another direction, several cousins in another direction, and there was a sense of familiarity. There were Jews from different parts of Europe, largely from the Eastern European countries, the Ukraine, the Soviet Union, the Baltic states. There was one Jewish kid from France in my high school. So in a way, it was a very unreal sense of how the world's population distributed itself over several continents. And when I left my neighborhood to go to McGill University, where I did my undergraduate degree, it was like going to a strange country with no passport. It was quite unusual.
Now, you said there was you were like a tugboat between the French and the English.
Yeah, the two populations in Montreal.
How did the French view you? Well, I'm in the Jewish community.
The interesting thing is there were two major communities, pretty much indifferent to one another.
Okay.
Kind of a mild, the
French were indifferent to
an
the English?
antagonism ranging from mild to severe, as in the separatist movement. It's a curious thing. There's a novel that came out a long time ago by Hugh MacLennan called Twin Solitudes, basically about two cultures, the two major cultures of Montreal, French and English, being living, they're contiguous basically, and generally unaware of one another. I remember participating in the International Poetry Festival in Paris, and there were some Francophone, there were both Francophone poets, Anglophone poets who translated one another and who read their own work at the Centre Pompidou. And there were Francophone poets from Quebec whom I'd never heard of. And God, I mean, I grew up in Montreal. I should have heard of them. That's changing now. But in a sense, that describes the ethnic map of Montreal when I grew up in the late 30s, 40s, 50s. I left Montreal in the mid-50s. There was an Italian area, a Jewish area, a Greek area, and so on. There's still some of that, I think, but not as pronounced as when I lived there.
Okay. Now, I was going to ask, you know, I'm always interested, I'm very interested in food, and in fact, I wrote a thesis on food in the fiction of Henry Roth, and I showed how, you know, how he assimilated through the food he ate, how he was just gradually assimilating. Actually, my advisor thought it was trivial at first, but then I proved her wrong, which was good. Ruth Weiss, a very noted scholar.
Ruth Weiss hosted the launch of my first book.
Wonderful.
Winds of Unreason.
She worked with Irving Howe and all that stuff. Yeah. She was good. But I proved her wrong, she said, so that was good.
So you studied under Ruth?
She was my advisor. I maybe met with her 3 times, I mean, but she was...
Which means that you were at McGill or?
Harvard, yeah.
That's right. She moved to Harvard finally.
Yeah.
Great. Okay.
Very distinguished scholar. But anyway...
Her name was Ruth Roskies when I knew her.
Ruth what?
Ruth Roskies. She was a wide-eyed kid of 18 years old.
Yeah. Wow. You've seen it all. So anyway, but food is sort of like the community glue. I mean, you talk about one of your aunts described, and you talked about these, you know, Passover meals, and one of your aunts described you as a long noodle. You never amount to anything like that.
That's right.
I mean, maybe you can talk a bit about food. And you know how it gels communities.
Yeah. Well, isn't it central to every culture? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's the in a sense it's a centerpiece of celebration. People sitting around a table, sharing things that sustain life. But I think I wasn't so aware of it until you just raised it now. It takes on another dimension here because it's also a barrier, basically. In other words, there are forbidden things that you're not supposed to eat.
And they're even more delicious sometimes.
As I discovered. So, you know, in a way, like leaving that little area of Montreal now called the Plateau, and going to the university, that larger world, and McGill was sort of an international university, so it really was, it was symbolic of a larger world. And just physically walking to McGill and walking to that sort of mecca of international culture was one thing. And then another rite of passage is eating the forbidden fruit. For Adam, it's the apple. For me, it was ham, bacon, and pork in that order.
That was, you know, that was in Henry Roth's Call It Sleep. He threw out his salami sandwich into the Hudson River and embraced the pork chop because he was with a Gentile professor he was having an affair with, and so he wanted to embrace the whole thing.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I notice food makes big occurrence in your place. Now, I was going to also ask you, you're a kind of, you are a peer of Leonard Cohen. Did you know him growing up?
Yeah, no, I knew him at McGill.
You know him at McGill. Tell us a bit about that. He was a poet. Yeah.
As a matter of fact, his first book was Let Us Compare Mythologies. It came out in the McGill Poetry Series. My Winds of Unreason was the third book in the McGill Poetry Series. Darrell Hine, who became editor of Poetry Chicago, was the second. The last time I saw Leonard was in Montreal. I told him that I was...
How long ago was this?
1959.
Wow, a long time ago. Right, wow.
I was going to England.
Yeah.
And he said, send me your address. He said, no, I'm going to be going there. I can't remember when.
Yeah.
And I wrote a postcard. I said, Dear Leonard, my address is 50 Hillfield Road, London, Northwest 3, etc. But I put the stamp on that side of the card, so it was mailed back to me. And I thought that I would not be fated to see him.
Right.
So I never sent it again. And I visited someone in Beckenham. I could not catch my Bakerloo train, caught another train. at what, 1:30 in the morning in the elevator of
And
the
this was
Hampstead
before he
Tube
was
station.
big, before he was a big name.
This was, yeah, he was known in Montreal. That first book of poems
Okay.
created quite a splash. And he was just getting into jazz and so on. And anyway, we sat on the street curb and talked until 3 in the morning, and then he went off to Hydra, and I stayed in London, and I never saw him again.
What was your impression of him then? This was a young Leonard Cohen.
I think the most talented poet ever writing in Canada.
Really? Wow.
You have to read his first book. I never read any of his things subsequently, an odd poem here and there. But I really did not know Leonard, sort of the cultural icon. I remember hearing him sing a song once, and it sort of put me off.
Yeah, he had this very deep and sorrowful.
I mean,
thing,
the songs didn't grab me. They don't, for me, reflect the incredible talent of that first book of poems. I
Couldn't
mean,
make a living, but they told him to
there's a
sing.
sense,
Yeah.
there's a sense of music there that you have to go back to Ben Jonson in the 17th century to find.
Wonderful. So I was going to ask you some more questions here. Excuse me.
So this is in a sense like the oral exam I had to take once, but here I
your
think
PhD, right?
I have a better sense of the answers.
Now, getting to your poetry in your wonderful book, Morning Gothic, you have a great poem about, among many, but about the Jewish cemetery. And, you know, even though it's a very silent spot, I like how you use all these things and that are talking, and the cemetery is talking through the flowers and all these things that you appoint in the poem. Mm-hmm. Maybe you want to read that poem.
It's a poem that started for me when I was doing a reading in Warsaw, and my host took me to the town Góra Kalwaria, where my mother was born. Góra Kalwaria translates into Hills of Calvary. And we looked for a surviving Jew that might show us around town. I wanted to find out where my mother had spent her early years. And anyway, we found someone that showed us around, and that the rest of it is explained in the poem. At the Jewish cemetery in Góra Kalwaria, dedicated to Felix Karpman, who rebuilt the Jewish cemetery. There are no hills here. The war flattened them. Peeled the earth like lemon rind, releasing mists that twist through earth in Hebrew characters on these stumps of stone. In neighboring fields, sparrows fly, aimless as tourists. My mother remembered part of it, an earlier part, how she clung to the synagogue floor like a crab when armies passed through and bullets splintered the walls. Her friend in blood loosened her grip. By the cemetery, roadside flowers rise to attention by slopes of willow, invading scrambles of weed. I'm handed a photo I plucked to life with my fingers. Jews marching from one margin to the other, beyond the photo to Warsaw's ghetto, carrying flour sacks stuffed with blankets, past the house owned by Borenstein, my mother's mother, who lathered her kitchen with laughter and sang eggs into cake batter. They carried their sacks beyond this Mebla sign, where my uncle baked bread and gossip. On a poster behind glass, Arnold Schwarzenegger bulges as Predator in black letters. Soon the hunt will begin. Here, where the cemetery wall stood, they were lined up. Those who hid in cellars, in tall grass, surfacing like frogs on marsh lilies to be plucked by birds with long beaks. After a few bursts, they became Poland. The cows in neighboring fields did not stir, and tanks passed over once, twice, a finale. Headstones lay like corpses in the camp yard, lathered over with paving tar. This is what Felix found, the town butcher, who separated meat from meadow sounds into cubes and strips, who released the stones, arranged them by height or alphabet or age. They blaze like shattered diamonds on emerald, soft as cloth or meadow, a gift for anyone who leaves the road and walks among stones that have found their soil but will not remain silent.
Now, I got to ask, the book is introduced by John Kinsella, and I know there's a Kinsella who wrote Shoeless Joe, right? Is this guy related in any way to him?
John is the Australian poet, critic, editor.
Oh, okay. Because I was saying he's Canadian, so I thought there was some. No, I didn't know about that.
There's another poem here which I always read. Will you let me read one of them?
Oh, yeah. I was just going to ask you, the poems about the Holocaust here, you didn't actually experience the Holocaust, but it's obvious you were a very close listener.
I was. I remember. Well, it was. My parents had relatives on the other side, and virtually every day in the Montreal Star there was a map of the front, so we were very attentive to that. I mean, at that point in the early 40s, no one knew exactly what was happening, but one had a sense of that there was a grim reality over there that we were separated from.
Yes, so read what you...
and this,
actually this part, just read some selections from your...
Feel free to interrupt. This poem, Night Train to Zagreb, started for me when I was on a night train from Paris to Zagreb in one of those typical European train compartments with six couchettes, one of which was occupied by a woman with a missing forearm. And when I was told about how that had come to pass, I remember being horrified and very much wanting to write something, but as often happens in a case like that, the experience just overpowered the ability to put it on a piece of paper. And from time to time, I would keep revisiting this experience with the same empty results. And when it finally came, the poem finally came 6, 7, 8 years after I had that experience. Some of the details, as they had originally been rendered to me, had become foggy. I couldn't remember, for example, whether the woman was a Serb who had lost her limb as a result of a Croatian raid on her village, or the reverse. And it bothers the narrator, who keeps asking questions like, was it this, was it that, was it here, was it there? Questions, it seems to me, far less significant than the violence, the intensity of the violence. So much so that language itself collapses from the smallest elements of language, vowels and consonants, which get raised at the beginning of the poem. Night Train to Zagreb. When gusts spread against the glass on the Orient Express to Zagreb, snow separates in alphabet. The vowels clinging to glass, consonants slipping into drifts. It must be this way for the howl to flatten the summons against the pain, the moaning against the arms of night, pushing it beneath unbroken meters of the train. Inside, one hand reaches for coffee, the other sleeve reaches the table, armless, turning in circles like a pendulum, raising questions as the train turns through the foothills. It was a Serb, or was it a Croat, who came out of a night like this with candlesticks, something in a bag, and she was there, something between the doorway and road, or was it the bedroom and kitchen? And he lowered to her as if to leave something behind, a kiss or something more memorable. We always misunderstand. And her arm was in the snow, possibly on a night like this, with less to understand than ice caking on glass over a broken-toothed moan in alphabet that never shapes.
Nice.
Do you want to hear one more poem?
You've got plenty of time. You actually have.
Well, I ought to read from
You have like
the memoir.
Yeah, you have 9 minutes at least.
Okay, well, this is a poem about falling out of love. When I was a graduate student, I studied lots and lots of poems about falling in love. I mean, the whole sonnet tradition from, Petrarch through Guillaume de Machaut, Wyatt and Surrey, etc., etc., etc. So I thought it'd be appropriate to have a poem about falling out of love here. And the poem is called Frozen White. There's one reference here to Decam, and it's a very expensive French dessert wine, Chateau Decam. Have you ever noticed on a day when ice cuts through wind and spears across the lake that you don't touch her hand across the sheet, the white, full, frozen, and you don't reach across 2 glasses of Decam, and you don't touch her reaching phrase, but let it drop into the twisted folds of the hooked rug, and you don't even stare at the fire as the cold pushes at the outside hinges and snow barrels down the roof, drifting up the windows, and you don't, and you don't, and you don't.
Nice. The nice repetition down there. Yes.
Enough poems, huh?
Enough poems? You want to read from your memoir?
Yeah, is there something
not?
you would like to hear?
Well, you know me with food.
We have about 8 minutes.
Yeah, we have about, let's say about, what do we have now? We have about 6 minutes.
Okay, well, that's perfect.
Or a little less than 6.
So this is, most of the book is about the Montreal ghetto that I grew up in, ending basically with when I left to McGill. But there's one chapter, there are a couple of chapters. One deals with the Laurentians, a very gentle mountain chain outside of Montreal, where Jews during the summer drifted to, factory workers basically, textile factory workers, and spent a couple of weeks, especially at one point during the 50s when we had an outbreak of polio. So this describes my first summer experience. My first trip to the Laurentians and several thereafter was not to Prefontaine, but to the foothills in Farmer Leblanc's fields in Lesage by a river where summer renters swam and fished. That was where I saw for the first time a world entirely different from the brick and stone structures that I passed from September to June. As soon as I stepped into the open air, I smelled the farmyard, the cows, chickens, and pigs, the stacked hay, the rich manure that filled the air from the neighboring barn by the paved highway and carried across fields into a wood. Here, for the first time, I was charmed by the supercilious stare of cows, by the way chickens shed their warmth along paths that they created. I accepted their mooing and clucking as language to be taken seriously. The openness of the fields, the orchestra of barnyard sounds and nocturnal chat of cicadas spoke to me of endlessness. No teachers, no books, only pastures to gaze at or games to play with other children until we were all covered in darkness. For 2 months I careened through a world of laughter and shouting with no parental referees. It was as though they had ceased to exist. And I find it ironic now to stare at the only photo I have of those days. Not a snapshot of the wonderful chaos of play, but a family photo taken on the weekend when my father came up from hammering out the dents in cars in order to plunge into the North River and store up sun for the coming week. The farm provided its own surprises whenever our play became too predictable. Kick the can was our daily game, a variation on hide and seek, but with the added pleasure of kicking an empty tin can into improbable shapes and improbable places. One day the tin landed in brush where Mr. Leblanc had laid a trap in order to put an end to the nightly assault of skunks on his chickens. Finally, one of the traps had snapped shut. Robert, the farmer's son, was young enough to love animals, but not old enough to shy away from a sleeky, furry creature. As he stooped to pat it, the skunk did what skunks do. Though Robert was bathed repeatedly, for the remainder of the summer none of us would play with him. As for the skunk, the farmer ended its career with one blow of a bough across its head. Mr. Leblanc had no ducks or geese, but he did keep a couple of pigs whose tenancy turned out to be brief. Shadowing my idyllic memories of the farm was a late August ritual which brought the farmer's brother and grown nephew from a neighboring town. On that day, the pig selected for the occasion departed from its habit of snuffing around the barn for slops. It fidgeted, tried to move away from the humans approaching. Before long, the farmer and his brother had trussed the pig's legs while the other members of the family held the pig on its back. As the Leblanc family hovered like a team of surgeons, it responded with squeals which were as close to a human sound as I've ever heard coming from an animal. That was the last we heard before its throat was slit. Not long after that, perhaps 2 or 3 days, our family car was packed again, my brother and I wedged in our places, and pointed toward Clark Street. Somehow it was fitting that the summer ended with that porcine dirge. It was our way of learning that even summer idyls come to an end, and that the days of summer finally have their nightfalls and their frosts. Paperman's funeral parlor was barely visible from our rear balcony on Clark Street. But from time to time I made out its hearses moving slowly along St. Durban Street, past the synagogue, to cemeteries on the outskirts of the city. A sonority in the air, the iconography of death, but not death itself. The death of a classmate, Benami Hill, in the 2nd grade, brought the event closer. Over the years, he has dimmed in memory to an oval face whose features I cannot make out. He died from tuberculosis at a time when other sufferers were sent to a sanatorium outside St. Agathe for a mountain cure.
We're running out of time. I just wanted to...
3 sentences.
All right.
As far as I was concerned,